welcome back to this bite-sized episode of the Mission Makers podcast. We're going to dive back into some of our favourite episodes of the season and pull out some of the key lessons from our amazing guests that will hopefully inspire and fuel your missions wherever you are in the world. So it's no secret that I'm a massive petrol head, and I had the absolute privilege of interviewing one of the best journalists in Formula One, Peter Windsor, who's also served as a team manager for Williams F1 and was also the general manager for Ferrari in the 90s. It's safe to say our guest on this week's Bite Size episode has worn many hats in the sport, and so he shares with us his expert insights into Formula One and beyond.
I always think that it's better to do something absolutely flat out 100% to the best of your ability than it is to do lots of different things and have lots of different interests, which is kind of what my mum always wanted to encourage. But I was always 100% focused on what I want to do, and not to the exclusion of everything else, but almost to the exclusion. Because if you're going to do it, you might as well do it the best you can possibly be. Funnily enough, another athlete that always made a big impression on me was Jimmy Connors, the tennis player. And I don't know if this is true or not, but I remember reading about Jimmy Connors that although there was no animosity that he felt to the other players, whenever we went to a tournament, he tried to make sure he stayed in a hotel away from all the other players or the key players that he was likely to meet, because he didn't want to have any interaction with them. He just wanted to focus completely on his own game and his own life. And I kind of get that. And I think I'm probably guilty of not being as social and as perhaps supportive to friends as I could have been over the years, because I similarly had that approach to journalism when I did start to find my feet and I was going regularly to Grand Prix, writing for lots of different magazines. I kind of wanted to be in my own world. And if I saw the bulk of the British journalists over at the Elf motorhome with Ian Young having lunch, I would go to talk to the Italians or the French. I would go somewhere else. And it was just, I don't know, I've always had that feeling of wanting to do my own thing, my own way, I guess. And sometimes it's led me down the wrong path, for sure. But it is something that has enabled me to keep my love of motor racing, for want of a better word, to keep it as pure and as honest as it can be, as I can be to it, if you like. And I don't really want to lose any of the things that captivated me when I was a kid. I want those still to be burning inside me. And I think that there's so much information out there now, and there are so many people expressing opinions on media platforms, that if you did go into that, or if I went into that, my brain's not big enough to be able to handle all that. I need to keep things very simple and basic. I need to think about what I love about motorsport, who I respect in motorsport, what drivers I think are doing a great job, and focus on that. And that's kind of what's kept me going all these years. I think there's another thing that's grown inside me over the last 20 years perhaps, and that's hopefully because I've grown a little bit as a human being, and that is that basically, if you can do it, it is the following mantra: if you don't have something positive to say about somebody or constructive, don't say anything. In other words, don't just go in for harmful criticism because you didn't think that was an appropriate thing to do or you don't like that person. Don't say it. Don't go there. Only be positive and constructive. Constructive obviously does mean critical sometimes, but you've got to be able to show how things could be better, or perhaps how you would have done it in that situation. So that's kind of come into the way I try to do my job today.
That's very interesting because, you've obviously got a very successful YouTube channel that does critique the sport. So, and I think you manage quite a nice balance of, as you said, not being negative, which is great. So how would you change the current media approach to F1 in a live environment then, knowing that you need to still kind of, allow the audience into analysis and things like that?
Well, it's a very, very good question, because recently there have been quite a lot of surveys put out by the teams to the journalists saying, what do you think of our media service? What do you think of this? What do you think of that? How could we improve it? And you know what? My conclusion is that, as I, probably many others, but certainly as I predicted several years ago, the future of Formula One is for each of the teams effectively to have its own TV channel and its own media empire. And the top teams, of course, do that really well now. And we're going to see that with Aston Martin as well, for sure. And everything is so polarized now that Formula One fans per se, I think, are quite few on the ground. I think there are lots of McLaren fans, lots of Mercedes fans, lots of Ferrari fans, And all those people go to those team websites and all their media platforms to get their information. And so it's a very good question to ask, I think, is what is the role, therefore, of the objective, supposedly objective media, which is not associated with any of those teams? Because it's very difficult now, actually, if you're not in a team, to have access to the drivers, to the engineers, to what's going on. And the teams, of course, let as little information out as they can, but as much as they possibly want to, just to get the audience. And it's as if the rest of the media then has to pick up the fragments of what's left and try to make the best of it and get some sort of picture. And if you look at the declining sales of all the big motoring magazines, obviously there's not a big market out there anymore for people wanting that objective view. You could argue that maybe that's picking up now with the YouTube channels and the websites of those, effectively, of those magazines, where the magazines used to be. But of course, that's free. So it's not a direct comparison. In the old days, not the old days, but not so long ago, somebody would pay whatever it was, £2.50 for Autosport and £1.50 for Motoring News every week. And that was it. That was how your information, that's how you got your information. Yeah. Now that doesn't happen. Now you go, if you're a Lewis Hamilton fan, you go to the Mercedes website, you go to the Mercedes YouTube channel, Mercedes, Twitter, Facebook, whatever, Instagram, and then you put your picture together and you got your information. So I suppose this is a very long-winded way of saying, I don't really know, is what the answer is. What would we want in a perfect world? I think, putting aside the media, I think what the fans need much more and what they're not getting is lots and lots of great content between the Grand Prix. And that also includes maybe the evenings building up to the Grand Prix, when the teams are debriefing or at the hotel. I think we should see a lot more of that, have a lot more access to that moment. And then, obviously, after the last Grand Prix of the season and before the new season starts, there should be much more of it around. But the teams just sort of basically go into hibernation. And that's where, I think Formula One misses a massive trick. I've said many times in various columns, F1 Racing and on my site, that if I was running world motorsport, for want of a better word, I would ensure that all the top teams have their top drivers doing world tours between the two seasons, promoting Formula One in key countries. Countries where we're not getting great audiences, like China is a very good example. Everybody wants to make money out of China, but at the same time, nobody's watching Formula One in China. How do you solve the problem? You build up the sport. Obviously, you need to have an infrastructure to build up young Chinese drivers as well. But, if Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen and Charles Leclerc went to Shanghai, we're not talking the COVID era, obviously, just normal circumstances, went to Shanghai for a 2-week blitz tour of Shanghai, doing lots of events, karting, big charity auctions, all sorts of stuff. It wouldn't hurt, would it? Wouldn't hurt, but they don't do that. So I think that's one area where we really need to pick it up, that stuff, that fallow period between the seasons. Speaking purely personally, I think being able to chat to drivers when they're relaxed and they haven't got 25 microphones in front of them is something we don't have anymore. And I used to be able to, whether it be Ayrton Senna, Jackie Stewart, Jim Clark, obviously, but in more recent times, even Michael, you could chat to them when they weren't, performing in front of mics, and you could just say, "Oh, Michael, by the way, I heard you miss a gear on what happened then?" And he'd say, "Oh, yeah, okay, yeah, sure, that did you?" And there'd be a bit of a chat. But you can't even do that now, and I think that is very sad, really. That doesn't exist. You can't really talk to the mechanics either. I used to know the names of every mechanic in the pit lane in every team, their background, and we always used to club together if one of them was in problems. We don't know any of them anymore because teams think you're not supposed to go near them, and it's just pathetic, really.
100%. And you obviously work very closely with Frank for a number of years. What's one of the key things that you learned from him about effective management and strong leadership?
Well, Frank was of the Jimmy Connors mode, total focus. So that enhanced everything that I was thinking anyway. So Frank was that on steroids, really. He was totally committed to running and to Formula One, and nothing else was of interest to him at all. To the point where, he used to get pretty scratchy if he had to spend Sunday afternoons having Sunday lunch with the family. I was just like, I got to get out of here. I got to get back to the office and get on the phone and do something. So, that was Frank. I suppose that taught me that is a little bit over the top. I think with Frank also, one of the first things he said to me, and I started working for Frank initially on the sponsorship side, marketing side, he said, one thing I never want you to do, Peter, and which I've never done. I've never, ever poached a sponsor from another team, never even approached them, let alone tried to get them. And I don't want you to do the same either. And this was at a time when quite a lot of sponsors were walking out the door to Ron Dennis and McLaren. So, that I always respected Frank for that. And it was the same with personnel. He said, I don't poach personnel from other teams. And the third thing Frank said was never begin a sentence with the word but. And I never have ever since. Well, I don't think I have. Tried not to anyway.
You alluded to it, earlier about, one of the main things at that time was really thinking about the dangers and the risks and the failure. And obviously the sport is so unique in the fact that failure is absolutely critical, because if you're not pushing yourself to the limit and figuring out where that limit is, you won't succeed. So what's been one of your biggest learnings from failure in this environment?
In terms of real practicalities, I've had 3 attempts to do Formula One teams of my own, and all 3 have failed. But I can look myself in the mirror and say that if I had drawn up a list of all the things that I could have predicted might go wrong with each of those 3 projects, the thing that actually happened, I would never, ever have dreamt of, because it was so way off left field that it was something that I don't think anybody could have predicted. And then I rationalized that by saying, and I guess that means that Formula One is just one huge ocean liner, and there's a captain of that ocean liner, and if he doesn't want you on the ship, you just get thrown overboard. And I think that's still the case today, really. Formula One is a private club, and I suppose it's that, the recognition of the private club, play by the rules, and often I don't play by the rules because for ethical reasons or for reasons of thinking that I can do it better, probably mistakenly. But I think it's that. I've come up against Bernie Ecclestone several times. And although he's given me a lot of work over the years, and I've worked for Formula One for a long time and hopefully will in the future, he's a very difficult guy in a number of ways. And I suppose I've failed in not being able to predict how he was going to react to various situations when I thought smugly that I probably was able to predict him, but I wasn't. And I guess that's one area where I have to say I failed.
Talking about when you were a manager at Williams, and you had to manage legendary drivers, obviously, such as Carlos and Nigel Mansell, both of whom have been at the helms of some of the fiercest rivalry with other drivers in the sport. And in that situation, what strategies can a manager use to calm down the politics? Or is there an acceptance within the team that, there's no turning back, the relationships have really soured, and it's either going to be a very slow or fast burn for the team or for the driver?
Wow, that's a really interesting question. I think my approach to it was always to try to get them to focus on their side of the garage, as Mark Webber would say, and not to let it get to them. But of course, they were both intelligent, very competitive people who, above all, wanted to beat their teammates. So it was never easy. It was always a difficult time. It was very difficult. If you talk to Nigel now about his relationship with Keke Rosberg, he'd probably say, oh, Keke was brilliant. We got on really well. He's a lovely guy. I learned a lot from him. I think he would say that. I don't know. I don't want to put words in his mouth. But I can tell you the reality was there was massive aggravation between those two. Not from Nigel's side, really, but I think Keke understandably got very rattled by how quick Nigel was and what Williams were not doing about that. And the same, obviously, with Nelson. If I was running a team today, I would always go for the harmonious relationship with the best possible number one driver I could get. And then I'd have a very comfortable driver in the other car. A bit like Max Verstappen, Sergio Perez now, or Max Verstappen, Alex Albon, you've got to say. If you've got Max Verstappen, you can basically put anybody in the car except Lewis or Charles Leclerc, I would suggest, and equally for those other two as well. Mercedes have got a great setup with Lewis and Valtteri Bottas. If they put George Russell in there, it would definitely unsettle Lewis, and you wouldn't therefore be getting the best from Lewis. And you could say, oh, well, that's Lewis's problem. He's got to get out and beat George. But from Mercedes' point of view, you want the best from Lewis. So there's no point in creating that, that friction.
There's obviously been a lot of crises that Formula One has faced, along the last few decades. Do you think COVID-19 was one of the worst? And do you think that the sport can survive if the crisis goes on for much longer? Obviously, they've handled it really, really well. They've set, they've really showed an example of how a sport can operate under the circumstances. But from a financial perspective?
Yeah, well, I suppose you could say we're lucky that the COVID crisis has occurred in the Liberty era, because there can't be many owners of huge sporting franchises with pockets as deep as Liberty Media, and they were digging deep into them to keep the championship alive in 2020. Obviously, they're hoping they don't have to do that again, but I suspect if they have to, they will in 21. So I think we all have to take our hats off to them for doing that and making that championship happen last year, and hopefully it'll be an easier time for all in 21 once the vaccine gets properly underway. I think that it's, Formula One has had many crises over the years, and over the years, they've reacted incredibly well to everything that's gone on around it. And Formula One is about people, just as engineering is really about people. And I can honestly say that I cannot walk down a Formula One pit lane today, on the basis that I can talk to a few people, and not have a couple of conversations without walking away and saying, wow, that guy's brilliant. I wish I had his brain, or I learned a lot from that conversation. It's just full of amazingly sharp people. And I think if you look at the way Formula One reacted to the COVID crisis, almost without thought, really, it's just a reflex action of what do we do to make things happen. I think that was a case study for the rest of the world, actually, to follow. And I don't understand why, for example, the British government, I mentioned that because we're in the UK at the moment, I don't understand why the British government didn't say, or have the brains to say, let's just see how Formula One are handling this, and we'll kind of do the same thing. Oh, they're making masks compulsory for everybody from day one. We'll do the same. Oh, they're doing social distancing even on a starting grid when people aren't that close anyway, because there aren't that many people on the grid in 2020. We'll do the same. Why didn't they just copy all of Formula One things, Formula One's concepts from day one, and apply that to the running of the country? And we know now that if the UK Prime Minister had said masks will be mandatory from March the 1st, 2020, and social distancing mandatory March the 1st, 2020, I would think we'd be in a better shape now. And obviously you need a lot of research going into the vaccine. But then again, I'm amazed that Formula One was only used for production of masks and a few other things, and perhaps logistics and distribution. The industry got behind everything that was going on in the country really well. But I'm surprised that more Formula One brains weren't tapped into when it came to the formulation of vaccines. Because some of these guys are so bright that they could very quickly have applied their knowledge to what was going on at Oxford University. I think the world at large has missed a trick by not watching what Formula One has been doing and what great Formula One people have been doing during the COVID crisis.
And talking about YouTube and the changing digital landscape with journalism and reporting, obviously you've been, you've rode the whole wave, and you've really embraced the digital age as well. Do you enjoy this format of YouTube? Do you have any tips for people who are looking to grow their own YouTube channels? And do you think that it's given you a lot more freedom to cover, what you want to talk about, really?
The interesting thing is how it's evolved into this whole new genre of young would-be filmmakers, directors, producing this new slick type of video, which is almost, in style, is almost unique now to YouTube. It's not a cinematic style, it's not a television style, it's a YouTube style. And it's developed this sort of creativity that becomes something that's quite intoxicating, actually. I don't enjoy all of it, and I don't personally feel comfortable with all the clickbait, short video, punchy lines, punchy titles that are there purely to generate numbers of hits and subscribers, because then you're going down the road of, we're not doing this for the right reason, we're doing it for some financial gain or something like that. But if you're doing YouTube because you really want to show that this young driver has enormous potential and this is why, or this event from the past was very significant because it influenced what happened then, or you're giving a commentary about what's happened in Formula One that day, hopefully objectively, to bring to life some of the events that might have just been, passing otherwise unsaid, then I think YouTube is a really good thing. That's how I approach it, to be honest. I don't have a brain that's capable of giving me to looking at a subject and looking at it anything other than a relatively straight, pure way. And I would never say, and I know some people put on a really difficult or catchy title to a YouTube video just to get people to click on it, even though the video has nothing to do with the title. Hopefully, I don't think that's a good thing, and maybe that needs to be looked at by YouTube.
Thank you guys for listening. Season 3 will be back with a bang in the autumn. Until then, we've got plenty of impactful bonus and bite-sized episodes coming your way. So don't forget to subscribe and share the show with your friends, because it truly means the world to us. And if you're interested in some super cool rewards like virtual DJ lessons with me, signed books from our guests, and exclusive merchandise, then head over to www.patreon.com/missionmakers to check out how you can start supporting the show for less than what it costs you to fill up your car. So till then, Mission Makers, be safe, be healthy, and be laser focused.